Public Nemesis Media.
Last time, we stopped somewhere in the late 18th and early 19th century. That was a very important period of time, and I'd argue that the modern era of humanity can trace its beginning a little over 200 years ago. The key player was the Industrial Revolution, which began in the 1760s on the British island and then spread out to the rest of Europe by 1840s. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution, European societies abandoned their feudal system in favor of a brand new economic system called capitalism. Once capitalism entered in a piece of land, we would see another thing starting to take shape, which is connected to the arrival of capitalism and began in that period of late 18th and early 19th century. The another thing in question is nation. Now, what is a nation? Oxford gave a precise definition. A nation is a large body of people united by common descent, history, culture, and language, inhabiting a particular country or territory. What we count as a modern-day identity, what we today know as a German, Italian, or Russian, is basically what a nation is. Indeed, nation formation is modern identity formation. With the arrival of capitalism and the rise of nationalism in the late 18th and early 19th century, nations started to take form. Some national identities were formed relatively quickly, but some people were in a tough living situation, so their nation took longer to be formed. Some of them had to figure out which of the multiple names should be their national one, and some people were not aware of their nationality in general. For example, the Ukrainians, who were divided by the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires, were referred to as Ruthenians and Malorussi. But with the rise of Ukrainian nationalism in the mid-19th century, the name Ukrainian started to be used by the Ukrainian people as a nationality, and ultimately, it defeated the other two names. Another example worth looking at are the Poles. When the first Polish people migrated to the USA, a lot of them were not aware of their own nationality, but identified as Germans, Austrians, and Russians. The Polish national identity had yet to be fully formed, and its formation was slowed down due to occupations from Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. So it's no wonder some Poles didn't know their true national identity. Now, those are just a couple of examples. What about the protagonists of our story, the Macedonians? I found a couple of sources that mention the beginning of the Macedonian nationality around 1830, both referencing a bishop by the name Gavril, who identified as a Macedonian. I'm not sure I can completely confirm the existence of that bishop. I'd rather play it safe and say that the Macedonian nationality started in 1860s, which I'll explain a little later, but I think it's worth mentioning them because that was a period of time where people started writing about Macedonia again. Although Macedonia as a region and even as a name disappeared from the maps once the Turks occupied the Balkan Peninsula, the legend of Macedonia was passed down through generations, and hence the inhabitants of the Balkans still knew about that ancient empire. Travelers who went to Macedonia specifically wrote that the local population knew stories of many rulers that lived in that part of the Balkans in the distant past, such as Alexander the Great, King Marco, Tsar Samuel, etc. Being a fan of ancient civilizations and trying to find connections with them was not an uncommon practice among the Balkan peoples. The Croats, for example, had a pan-Slavic movement in the early modern period named after the Illyrians, an ancient people who lived in Western Balkans and who the Croats, as well as some other Balkan nations, view as their ancestors. Anyways, like I said, some people wrote about Macedonia in the 1830s and later. In 1835, Bulgarian enlightener Emanuel Vaskidovic wrote a book titled A Brief Political Geography for the Education of Bulgarian Youth, where he described the borders of Macedonia in great detail. Then, in 1843, Bulgarian cartographer Alexander Hadji Ruset created a map of the Balkan Peninsula with the borders of Macedonia clearly drawn. Both of these works were based on the Roman province of Macedonia, specifically the one after Diocletian reform of 293. You may remember from episode 1 that there was Macedonia Prima and Macedonia Salutaris, which together form a region that the people revived in the early 19th century in those exact borders. The Macedonian regional identity would turn into a national one for its Slavic inhabitants. Still, we have to talk about why the Macedonian nation forming started a bit later and why it took so long for that nation to be formed. You see, just like the Polish people, in the earliest stages of nationalism, most Macedonians were not aware of their nationality. A very small number of Macedonians in Azot and Porece identified as Serbs, a bigger number identified as Greeks, even if some of them didn't speak Greek, and vast majority of Macedonians identified as Bulgarians. The Bulgarian name in Macedonia wasn't anything new. It was introduced there once the First Bulgarian Empire conquered it in the 9th century. It was a name that survived to the 19th century alongside the Macedonian name and the tribal names. Dimitar Angelov, a historian from Bulgaria, found proofs that the Slavs from Macedonia called themselves Macedonians, Bulgarians, and Dragovids since the Middle Ages. So, much like it was the case with Ukrainians, you had one people group with three names: the tribal name, such as Dragoviti, the Macedonian regional name, and the Bulgarian political name. We can already drop the tribal names. Sure, they survived to the 19th century, but there was no way for one tribal name to replace all other tribal names. That leaves us with Macedonian and Bulgarian. The very beginning and the earliest stages of the Macedonian national revival did not have the Macedonian label attached to it yet, but the Bulgarian one. Let's explain why the Macedonian national revival started as Bulgarian. The Macedonians were in a very difficult situation. They were in the heart of a hectic part of Europe, and everyone wanted their land. They were occupied by the powerful Ottoman Empire, and the 1767 abolishment of the Ohrid Archbishopric opened doors to the Hellenization of educated people. The church liturgies were in Greek, and even worse, the schools in which Macedonians studied were Greek. Because of that, educated Macedonians adopted a Greek national identity. The already mentioned Emanuel Vaskidovic, although born in what is today known as Pirin, Macedonia, was actually born as Manolaki Vaskidi and firstly went to a Greek school. You can also pick any significant Macedonian figure from early to mid-19th century, like say Dimitar Miladinov, and you'll find a Hellenized identity, or in his case, the name Dimitar Miladinis. The same thing was happening to Bulgarians. Their intelligentsia was also Hellenized, and since nothing can bring people closer than a common enemy, of course Macedonians and Bulgarians would work together. In the case of Bulgarians, the man widely regarded as the progenitor of the Bulgarian national revival, a Orthodox clergyman known as Saint Paisius of Hilendar, called out the Hellenized Bulgarians. In 1762, he wrote the Slavo-Bulgarian History, one of the most important works in the Bulgarian history, and in that book, he wrote this: "Some do not like to know about their Bulgarian lineage, but turn to a foreign culture and a foreign language, and do not care about their Bulgarian language, but learn to read and speak Greek, and are ashamed to call themselves Bulgarians. Oh, you unwise fool! Why are you ashamed to call yourself a Bulgarian and do not read and do not speak your own language?" As we can see, the Greeks definitely had the upper hand in the Balkans back in the day. Before the national identities were formed, your identity was based on your status in society. We saw that being educated meant being a Greek. However, the Greeks would regard you as one of them if you went from a villager or from being a shepherd to a town citizen or a merchant. Any Slav who had a higher status was deemed a Greek, but other Slavs were deemed as Vulgaroi, or in English, Bulgarian. The Greeks called all uneducated Slavs Bulgarians, but they used that name in a pejorative way, as an insult, if you will. Sometimes that would be so effective that some Slavs would be ashamed to call themselves Bulgarian, as it meant poor and uneducated, yet they'd proudly say they were Greeks, which they viewed as an honorable name. This was the thing St. Paisius was so angry about. Greeks calling all Slavs Bulgarians wasn't too unusual. Something like that existed in Romania, where Slav was synonymous with Serb, and Romanians viewed and called all Slavs, including the ancestors of modern-day Bulgarians, Serbs. Going back to St. Paisius' book, in order to prove that the earliest Slavic books and script from the time of St. Cyril and Methodius were Bulgarian, he claimed that, sure, those books were called Slavic, however, the Greeks have always called those books Bulgarian. At the end of the day, Greeks admit that themselves. In The Northern Ethnological Boundaries of Hellenism, a book written by the Greek professor Stilpon Parskeva Kyriakides, you can find the following text. During Simeon's reign, the Dragoviti, Strumyani, and in general all Sclavinias were distinguished from the Bulgarians. During Samuel's reign and thereafter, the name of Sclavinias vanished altogether. The Macedonian Slavs were designated by the Byzantines under the general name of Bulgarians, and the country conquered by them from Samuel, i.e. the West and North Macedonia, was from now on called Bulgaria. Thus, the Greeks themselves gave the name of Bulgarians to all Slav-speaking populations and named Bulgaria not only the Bulgarian territory, but Greek provinces as well. We then ourselves gave to the Bulgarians the right to lay claim over regions and populations with which they had nothing in common. Regardless, this practice of calling Slavs Bulgarians indiscriminately was adopted by Macedonians. This is why the earliest Macedonian enlighteners referred to themselves as Bulgarians and their language as Bulgarian. At times, they'd go so far as to call the population of Bohemia and Moravia Bulgarians. Yes, really. Yet we're just now gonna talk about the biggest reason why the Macedonian national revival started as Bulgarian. As it was already said, you had a Hellenic spiritual occupation on one side and the Turkish literal occupation on the other side. It would be almost impossible for Macedonians to free themselves on their own. So, they found a potential savior that would liberate them: Russia. The Russian Empire had a lot of interest to expand their influence in the Balkans, and they proved that they could. The Russians have been at war with the Turks on and off since 1568, and they won most of the battles. Once they arrived to the Balkans, the Russians met a lot of Slavs just like them, specifically Bulgarians, and so they got an idea. They would help the Bulgarians free themselves from Turks and Greeks, as long as Bulgarians would be loyal to the Russian Empire. In order to do that, they needed to lift the Bulgarian conscience higher to help Bulgarians in their nation building. In 1829, a Bulgarian Slavist by the name Yuri Venelin released the first volume of Old and Modern Bulgarians, a book that helped awakening the Bulgarian national consciousness among Bulgarians. One of those Bulgarians was Vasil Aprilov, a leading figure of Bulgarian national revival who helped establish secular Bulgarian education in Bulgarian schools. He, like many educated Southern Slavs, called himself a Greek, but when he met Venelin, who showed him his work and convinced him to start gathering Bulgarian songs, Aprilov dropped Hellenism and became aware of his Bulgarian nationality. With the financial help from wealthy Bulgarians and Russians, Vasil Aprilov opened the first modern secular school in Bulgaria on January 2, 1835. That was just the first step of getting away from the Greek spiritual slavery. Seeing the opportunity, Macedonians jumped on board and worked closely with Bulgarians in hopes that Russia will help them too. Indeed, that was a period of time when the Macedonian national revival was connected to the more advanced Bulgarian national revival. The first teacher in Aprilov's school was a monk from Macedonia called Neofit Rilski. In that same year of 1835, he published the first grammar book of the modern Bulgarian language, Bulgarštinata, which can be translated as Bulgarianness, was spread in Macedonia to counter Greek influence. A Bulgarian diplomat named Atanas Shopov has gathered material of Bulgarian revival in Macedonia. There, he wrote about Macedonians who viewed themselves as Greeks, but Russian politicians sent some of them to study school in Moscow, where they would receive the Bulgarian spirit. Once they returned to Macedonia, they would spread Bulgarianness among their people, and they too would get a Bulgarian conscience. There were a lot of cases like that. Remember Dimitar Miladinov, the man who worked as a Greek teacher and called himself Dimitar Miladinis? Well, his life changed once he met Viktor Grigorovich, a Russian Slavist, who urged him to work on the Bulgarian grammar and gather Bulgarian songs. That is confirmed in Miladinov's letter addressed to Grigorovich, where he wrote that he did exactly what Grigorovich told him to. After meeting Grigorovich, Miladinis became Miladinov, and he also became a big opponent of Hellenism. There was another letter, this time addressed to the Bulgarian revivalist Alexander Exarch, where Dimitar Miladinov wrote that Hellenization was the biggest enemy of Slavdom. Alongside his brother Konstantin Miladinov, who studied Slavology in Moscow, he decided to prevent Macedonians to become Greeks by teaching his students with Bulgarian books. Konstantin Miladinov sent his brother 2 books in Bulgarian, one for church singing and the other was a Bulgarian gospel. But Dimitar Miladinov thought that wasn't enough, hence why he wrote to Alexander Exarch, asking him for primers, grammars, geographies, and other books that would help him fight. Miladinov did spread Bulgarianness among people he had contact with. He even convinced a Vlach by the name Xenophon Zinzifi to change his name to Raiko Zinzirov and release his songs as Bulgarian. The Miladinov brothers also released Macedonian songs under the name Bulgarian Folk Songs in 1861, though there were actually 77 songs from Bulgaria. I can continue giving examples, but I believe I made my point that Macedonians and Bulgarians worked together under the Bulgarian banner. It wasn't unusual that 2 similar people groups would do that. The Croats and the Serbs also collaborated during the early modern period, and that's why they were presented with one color under the Serbo-Croat name on most ethnographic maps. Heck, even today you can hear about the single Serbo-Croatian language. It made sense for Macedonians to do the same with Bulgarians. The Bulgarianness has successfully defeated Hellenism, and it was only a matter of time when Russia would free Macedonia within the large Bulgarian state. The truth is, Macedonians and Bulgarians have at one point worked together towards a common Bulgarian nation and a common Bulgarian country, and there's nothing to be ashamed of. That was simply a result of the overwhelmingly difficult situation back then, and Macedonians gladly took help from the brotherly Bulgarian people, which I'm thankful for. Unfortunately, I must address the problems. The presence of Bulgarianness and the collaboration under the single Bulgarian banner have been abused for decades now. Even today, the Bulgarian name in Macedonia is used as an argument to claim that Macedonian historical figures are Bulgarian, that Macedonians don't have a history, that Macedonians are Bulgarians, that Macedonians are brainwashed Bulgarians, that the Macedonian nation is just an artificial creation by communists, that the Macedonian nation doesn't exist, that the Macedonian language doesn't exist, etc. All those narratives, which I personally witnessed for years, have forced me to dedicate this part of the video to shattering the illusion that Macedonians and Macedonia are Bulgarian. First of all, the thesis that Macedonians were ethnic Bulgarians for over 1,000 years is nonsense. I talked about what a nation is and why it's a modern phenomenon. The Bulgarian nation is a 19th century creation, but so are most other nations. To say that being a shepherd and then a merchant was converting from one nation into another is just ridiculous. If status and even religious affiliation mattered much more than language, history, territory, culture, and descent, then we can't speak of nations back then, only political identities.
Ами, от една страна, ясно е, че политическата власт се легитимира през създаването на подобни чувства за принадлежност и подобни риторически стратегии. Няма никакво съмнение, че той е част от владетелската идеология. Ето защо в тази ситуация е коректно да поставим въпроса и за политическите съдържания. Тоест, използването на българи като политоним, а не като етноним. Ако разгърнем книгата на Димитър Ангелов за образуването на българската народност, издадена през 1971 година, не напразно съобщавам тия данни, да се знае, че става дума за изследване на 50 години, там ще видим основополагащите митове на българската нация тъкмо от 19 век. Тоест, какво прави българите да са българи през средновековието? Ами прави ги това, че те имали общ език, общи традиции, общ фолклор, общ бит, общи обичаи и какво ли още не. Всъщност това е дълбоко невярно.
The fact that Bulgarian was a polytonym before it was a nationality have been confirmed by people who visited Macedonia. Winifred Gordon wrote in her book, A Woman in the Balkans, that calling Macedonians Bulgarians was just a relic from the 10th century, and the term had only a political, not an ethnological significance, hence why Bulgarian in no way designated the real nationality of Macedonians. The same thing was written by the Croatian folklorist Stefan Verković. That man spent 10 years in Macedonia before he released a book with a lot of folk songs from that region. Sure, he titled the book Folk Songs of Macedonian Bulgarians, but if you read the preface, you'll clearly read that Verković clarified Macedonians were originally called Slavs and then later took the name from their Bulgar conquerors, which was a political and state name, not a national one. Still not convinced? Let me show you this one video I came across. Take a look at these people. You're probably wondering who on earth are these Asians I'm showing? These are Bulgarians. I promise I'm not trying to make a Tatar joke. This is footage of descendants of Volga Bulgars, and they themselves say that they are Bulgarians. Although the Bulgar state on the Volga River disappeared in the 13th century, we still have people who call themselves Bulgarians and claim to be brothers of Bulgarians from Bulgaria, despite not being white, let alone Slavs. I even found a source that it's not only the Tatars there, but the Romani there too call themselves Bulgarians. I have even a bigger proof that Bulgarian was a political name, the Gagas. For those unfamiliar with them, the Gagas are a Turkic people who lived in northeastern parts of modern-day Bulgaria. It was documented by Bulgarian sources that after the end of the 9th Russo-Turkish War in 1829, a lot of Gagas, due to Ottoman pressure, moved to Bessarabia, which was under Russian control at the time, and they were written down on the refugee list as Bulgarians. A small number of them who have stayed in Bulgaria have also declared themselves as Bulgarians at the 1880 census, which stunned the Bulgarian intelligentsia at the time. Today, the Bulgarian historians who bother to talk about the Gagas admit that they had the Bulgarian label on them at one point in history, and guess what? That's used as an argument to say that Gagas are also ethnic Bulgarians and have been for centuries, but were forcibly debulgarized by outside factors like Macedonians. You see, that's the biggest problem of Bulgarian historiography. It's completely based on the Bulgarian label. The name is the alpha and omega. Nothing matters other than finding that name and using it to claim everything. You mean to tell me that the Volga Tatars, the Volga Romani, the Gagas, and Lazar Kolishevsky are all the exact same people as modern-day Bulgarians just because they had the Bulgarian name during some time? That's the reason why you can't build science around labels. So, how do we make a distinction between people? We go back to what a nation is: a group of people in one land united by a common past, tradition, language, culture, etc. Those are the things that matter. So, okay, the Turkic Gagas are not the same nation as Bulgarians, but Macedonians are Slavs. They should be the same people as Bulgarians, right? Right?
Sorry to disappoint.
Once again, it's true that Macedonians and Bulgarians worked towards a common Bulgarian nation, but it was during that time that many problems became noticeable. In 1851, Tsarigradski Vestnik, a Bulgarian newspaper, published an article which commented on the language used by Joran Hadjikonstantinov Džinot, a teacher from the Macedonian town of Veles. Sure, Džinot called himself and others Bulgarians. Then again, he did the same to the Slavs of Moravia, and his language, Bulgarian. But when commenting on that language used by Džinot, Tsarigradski Vestnik said, "As for Mr. Jordan's language, everyone can see why it is so different from our written and spoken language, because anyone who initially reads it will find it so incomprehensible, but also completely diverse." And it is true that that language, even though it may seem Bulgarian, its existence, like ours, is also taken from the church-written language, but still in the terms of type, that is, in terms of the expression of words and composition, it has so many properties and peculiarities that a foreigner, rather than a native Bulgarian, can more easily learn to speak it. May the people of Skopje and those who speak the same language as them forgive us, because they too do not understand and cannot speak our language. That was just the earliest example that showed the national differences between Bulgarians and Macedonians, and it's about to become impossible to ignore. Remember the books Macedonians asked from Bulgarians? Well, they soon gave them back because they couldn't understand the language used in them. We had teachers like Nikola Pop-Filipov who wrote articles in 1860s that said that books in Bulgarian were not much more understandable than the ones in Old Church Slavonic, hence why they got very little benefit from those Bulgarian books. It wasn't just schools. You also had enlighteners from Macedonia, like the poet Grigor Prlichev, who wrote in his autobiography that his knowledge of Bulgarian was so weak he had to use Old Church Slavonic. So let's just make a mix of the two languages that everyone could understand. That's far from a new idea. Matter of fact, Partenia Zogrovsky, a folklorist and cleric from Macedonia, had such idea back in 1858. That year he published an essay where he wrote on differences between Macedonian and Bulgarian, which the Bulgarian intelligentsia shouldn't ignore. How many major differences did he mention? 3? 4? 6? He mentioned 14 of them. So many differences, and the Bulgarian intelligentsia ignored every single one of them. Why did they ignore those differences? Because Macedonian culture was viewed as inferior and Macedonians as backwards Bulgarians. The Macedonian dialects, despite being viewed as Bulgarian, were insulted by Bulgarians because, as they said, they reeked of Albanianism, Hellenism, and Serbism, which were at times scapegoated for Macedonians' opposition to Bulgarian books. The Macedonians themselves had contempt towards Bulgarians, who they called shopi, as a way to signify cultural differences. Prlichev's autobiography confirmed that Macedonians called Bulgarians shopi. That was also confirmed by the founder of the Macedonian Revolutionary Movement, Petar Popasov, and we cannot forget that Kuzma Shavkarev, one of the biggest folklorists from his time, declared out loud, "We barely freed ourselves from Greeks. Are we supposed to become shopi now?" Some people claim that only the language was the problem, but that claim is not true. The language issue was not a standalone problem. It was the most obvious symptom of a much larger problem, that problem being trying to make one nation out of two different peoples. Ultimately, Macedonians were never incorporated within the Bulgarian nation because they had their own culture, language, territory, and history which was 9 times more not shared than it was shared. The truth is, if the problem was just about dialects, then it'd just be called a Bulgarian dialect in Macedonia. It wouldn't be called Macedonian. We wouldn't see Macedonians refusing to call their language Bulgarian. We wouldn't see the term Macedonian language being used at all. We wouldn't see talks about standardizing that Macedonian language. We wouldn't see Macedonians calling Bulgarians shopi. And most of all, we wouldn't see Bulgarianness and the Bulgarian name being dropped and the Macedonian regional identity turning into a national identity. But that's exactly what happened. Since 1860s, Macedonians started dropping the Bulgarian name and instead referred to themselves as Macedonians. They used terms like "we Macedonians" or "us Macedonians," and even statements like the one from Kuzma Shapkarev that Bulgarian was one thing and Macedonian the other. This is why I said the Macedonian nation forming started in 1860s. That was the period when they realized they had their own unique national characteristics, and the path towards the unique Macedonian nation was finally taken. There are no better proofs of the separate Macedonian national revival than Bulgarian politicians and actions from the Bulgarian government. One man who documented the Macedonian nation was a Bulgarian politician by the name Petko Slavekov. He issued many newspapers and magazines, one by the name Macedonia from 1866 to 1872. On January 18, 1871, he published his article, The Macedonian Question, which was about his personal experiences with Macedonians. Slavekov wrote that many times he heard from Macedonians that they are exactly that, Macedonians, not Bulgarians. Some said they had connection with the ancient Macedonians instead of Bulgarians, while others said they were pure Slavs, while Bulgarians were Tatars. On March 1st of the same year, he published another article about Macedonians, this time in a newspaper called Pravo. He repeated the same things, Macedonians saying they're not Bulgarians, they are Slavs and Bulgarians are Tatars, etc. However, this time, Slavekov showed how serious the situation was. He attacked Macedonians for their national separatism, calling them stupid people and extruded cattle for wanting to form the Macedonian nation instead of becoming a part of the Bulgarian nation. The most interesting part is that Slavekov wrote these words in the Pravo article. It is much better to teach children basic sciences in their native dialect, and it is much easier to learn them in it. However, recently, a year or two ago, when we talked to some Macedonians, we realized that they had another goal, a disastrous one: their separation from the Bulgarian people, which until now they had hidden behind the veil of linguistic dialect, but we finally managed to discover it. See? I told you that the language issue was just a part of a much bigger problem. Luckily for Bulgarians, the Macedonians were still somewhat dependent on Bulgaria, as the problems of Turkish rule and Hellenization had yet to be solved. The latter seemed to be solved with the establishment of the Bulgarian Exarchate in 1870. The Macedonians tried to free themselves from the Greek Church through the Catholic Unite movement in 1859, but that attempt was unsuccessful, proving how difficult the situation was. So when the Slavic Bulgarian Church was re-established, of course Macedonians massively voted for it to be in Macedonia. Despite that, Bulgarians criticized Macedonians for their lack of enthusiasm to work with Bulgarianness. First of all, it was mentioned that in 1861, when Bulgaria sent 28 delegates to Constantinople to work on the then church question, Macedonians didn't send a single man of theirs. Then they said that Macedonians love freedom more than them, but only if someone else fights for it for them, leading them to accuse Macedonians of being sneaky people without patriotism. Finally, when priests told Macedonians to express their Bulgarian nationality, Macedonians said, "Give me money and I'll become Bulgarian." That sentence was well known. almost notorious and was mentioned as something Macedonians said in writings of Petko Slavekov, Petar Berkovsky, Petar Poparsov, etc. Berkovsky wrote that in many places Bulgarianness was bought with money. This proves that Bulgarianness in Macedonia during the second half of the 19th century was much more about the wish for liberation and generally about interest rather than some genuine feelings of actually being Bulgarian. Even in 1878, when Bulgaria got most of Macedonia thanks to another Russo-Turkish war and the San Stefano Treaty, the Bulgarians were still unhappy with the absence of enthusiasm among Macedonians. The already mentioned Atanas Shropov wrote about how the abolishment of San Stefano borders was the fault of Macedonians. To quote him, "If today Europe asked the Macedonian people to declare themselves and say to which nationality they belong, we're convinced that a big part of Macedonia would slip from our hands. Aside from 2 or 3 districts in northern Macedonia, all other Macedonians are ready to give any sort of document you like that they're not Bulgarians. A bigger part of Macedonians are asleep and don't know anything about nationality and the Bulgarianness. No one would be able to destroy San Stefano, Bulgaria, if the whole Macedonia had the national awareness like the Bulgarians in Bulgaria and Thrace. If only one powerful Macedonian voice convinced Europe that the Bulgarians lived there." So, what did the Bulgarian politicians do once they realized that Macedonians were going their own way and that all collaboration were done out of interest rather than a genuine desire for unification? Well, to put it simply, they declared an all-out war against the very idea of a Macedonian nation and anything that was specific to Macedonia. Thanks to their exarchate, the Bulgarians could now dictate how not just churches, but schools should operate. The Bulgarian literary language was forced to be used by Macedonians. The teachers and priests came to Macedonia from Bulgaria and got working positions there over the locals. Any wish for Macedonians for self-governing in any form of autonomy was crushed. Everything Macedonian was banned because it was considered separatism, and ultimately, the Macedonians were forcibly and artificially given a Bulgarian national conscience. What, you think I'm kidding with the last part? Those Bulgarians who came to Macedonia openly said themselves that they came to Bulgarize it. The Bulgarian intelligentsia was so afraid of Macedonians slipping away from them and anything specific to Macedonians that not only did they, as they said, had to Bulgarize Macedonia, but their paranoia was so absurd that they destroyed even the slightest hint of Makedonstinata or Macedonianness. Let me show you what I mean. The Macedonian students in Sofia had their own magazine called Loza in early 1890s. They only released 6 issues of the magazine before the Bulgarian government banned it. The reason for the ban was separatism. Ever since the first issue of the magazine, the Macedonians that made Loza were attacked for believing that their fatherland was Macedonia, that it was inhabited by a unique Macedonian Slavic people, that they were using the Macedonian language for the magazine, and that they wanted to separate Macedonia from Bulgaria. The funny part was that Lozarite, as the Loza creators were called, didn't even explicitly say that they worked on national separatism. It was just that Bulgaria was fully aware of the separate Macedonian nation and had to keep it within Bulgarian orbit by attacking even the tiniest evidence of its existence. Indeed, anything that wasn't pure Bulgarian was considered separatism that tore the Bulgarian nation apart. We cannot underestimate the war on Macedonian uniqueness and its consequences. One final thing I'll show are descriptions of that ideological war in a book called Stambolovness in Macedonia and its Representatives. While on surface it may seem like criticism against the then Bulgarian Prime Minister Stefan Stambolov, the book goes much more in detail about Macedonian policy towards Macedonia. Also, Stambolovness wasn't written by some random guy, it was written by the already mentioned pioneer of the Macedonian revolutionary movement, Petar Poparsov. I'm just gonna get straight to the point and show what Poparsov wrote in the book. Here are notable parts. All these people named as separatists by Stambolovists are actually all intelligent Bulgaro-Macedonians whose separatism consists in the fact that they are against the centralization of the church school power. In other words, it's a young Bulgaro-Macedonian party that defends the self-governing and the old rights of the Bulgaro-Macedonian municipalities. A department in Constantinople, which would take care of the good process of the school in Macedonia, is simply and purely a North Bulgarian Jesuit order with a certain task, defined at the beginning of that article, a task that also contains the tendency to create Bulgarians in Macedonia. This tendency, by the way, was derived from the main task of the educational department and formed by some exalted patriots in order to justify their furious persecution against personal enemies or principal opponents who put the interests of their native land above all else, for which they were called by the loud name separatists. And the exarchate gives money and buys wind, because nationality cannot be bought with money. It is such a delicate thing that, as soon as it feels that it is being bought, it explodes. Nationalism as an idea can only exist in people who are inspired by higher ideas in general. What else do you want from the dolls that the exarchate regime creates? Our people's exarchate is quite consciously striving to kill any more independent movement among us, to take away any opportunity for the Macedonian to deal with more sublime social issues, and in this way, the people's exarchate thinks to place the Bulgaro-Macedonian spirit in complete dependence on it, to enclose it like a chicken in a cage. To hell with this money. If our municipalities, by killing them, don't even believe it, but rather impose all sorts of chairmen, bishops, directors, teachers, etc. on them in order to control the sums, the only motive of Bulgarian propaganda. Yes, Bulgarian propaganda. Now that you heard all these things, not just from Petar Poparsov's book, but from this video in general, I want you to answer this question honestly. Does this sound like the same people to you? I mean, what's their message? Macedonians are pure Bulgarians, but it has to be forced by all means necessary, because we don't crush everything Macedonian, then that's separatism. The collaboration with Bulgarians did have positives, but I can't deny the damage it did to the Macedonian ethnogenesis. This is why some people deny that there ever was a Macedonian national revival and claim that everything and everyone Macedonian was actually Bulgarian. Many love to point out that Macedonian revolutionaries mistakenly labeled their national conscience as Bulgarian and that they used literally Bulgarian, but they never give context. The Greek-imposed Bulgarian political identity and the collaboration of Macedonians with Bulgarians, which was much more from interest than a genuine connection, don't really mean much when you have to artificially and forcibly keep Bulgarianness in Macedonia and place the Bulgarian name as the national identity of Macedonians. Those policies have stunned Macedonian growth. They are the reason why it took for the Macedonian nation and literally language to fully form noticeably later compared to most nations, and also why the Bulgarian national revival swallowed the Macedonian ethnogenesis completely. Considering that the appropriation of Macedonian past and claiming that Macedonians are just confused Bulgarians made into a fake nation is going on to this day, the Macedonians have still not recovered from the damage done to their ethnogenesis. The good news, however, is that despite all of the things that happened and are happening, the uniqueness of Macedonians was never destroyed. The Bulgarized revolutionaries still call themselves Macedonians, or at very least Macedonian Bulgarians, Many felt more like Macedonians first and then Bulgarian. Outside visitors, like Vasil Kontrov, the Bulgarizer, confirmed that Macedonians called themselves that and were called that by other nations. And ultimately, Macedonians realized that freedom won't come from Bulgaria or anyone else from the outside. Only they could liberate themselves. And so they made an independent revolutionary movement meant to make Macedonia free. That movement will be the center of the next episode. For now, I'd like to thank you for watching this video. Before I sign out, I'd love to quote the legendary words of Mikhail Smatrkalev. Imagine a cardboard box with Bulgarian written on it, and you are not interested in what is in the box. We, unlike you, throw away the cardboard and are interested in the essence that is in it. We do not look at what's written on the lid of the box. Instead, we open it and pay attention to what is inside. PNM signing out.